Okay, today what we're going to do is we're going to get into the evolution of slavery. We're going to trace that all the way from the very beginnings at about 1619 all the way through to the Civil War. The last stage of slavery, kind of slavery as sort of we understand it or picture it today, really starts around 1660, and that once we hit that date, that same method of running plantations and things will continue all the way through to the 1860s. So for the next 200 years, that will be very stable. Most of the slaves come from the west coast of Africa, the left side of Africa there in the green. Most of the slaves are going to come from there, and most of those, about 10 to 15 million, most of those will actually wind up in South America. South America is going to be a much harsher climate, and the plantations there are much more brutal, just given the nature of the economy and the way things are working there. And if you'll look up, very few numbers of slaves actually come up to North America. The reason for this is that the importation of slaves into North America just doesn't require as many. They're importing more male and female slaves, whereas in South America they were importing more male slaves, and so the population of slaves was not self-sustaining or growing there. In North America, there's more male and female slaves, and so the population grows naturally. Now, if you'll look over to the right side of Africa, where Mozambique and Madagascar, that doesn't seem logical to import slaves from there, go all the way around the Horn of Africa, and then go to the Americas. The reason for that is that in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, England as well as the United States and several other countries are going to start outlawing the international slave trade. And this sounds illogical, but England wants to end the international slave trade, and they actually abolish slavery in the home country as well as their colonies. The United States is going to outlaw the international slave trade and will stop the importation of more slaves to North America. The politicians promise not to interfere with slavery in North America, but they are not allowing for the further importation of more slaves. And so the reason that once that occurs, the slave countries, the slave coast anyway, along the left side of Africa, that's going to be heavily watched by the United States Navy as well as English Navy and several other countries. And so slavers will go around the Horn of Africa, go to the back side, pick up slaves in Mozambique and Madagascar, and then truck them around in hoping to avoid any kind of smuggling crackdown that the United States as well as England is trying to put on them. Okay, most of the time, in the very, very early years anyway, whites would go into Africa and would actually capture slaves themselves in the very early years of African slavery that was imported to the New World. Very quickly, though, these slave traders would strike up deals with the African governments there to purchase slaves from them. Most of these are prisoners of war, and taking slaves as prisoners of war was pretty common practice in Africa before this. However, it's not treated exactly the same. The person that's a prisoner of war that was actually taken, they're a slave, but after working for a couple of, for several years, sometimes they are adopted into the group that took them. Also, any children that they might have are not considered slaves. They're just considered part of the group that took the slave originally. And so it's almost like an indentured servant kind of a thing. But white slavers are going to start purchasing these slaves, take them to the Americas, and they will be slaves there, permanently, and that status will pass down to their children. So most of the slaves are those kinds of slaves, that they're prisoners of war. A lot of times in the early years, these will actually be, one group will have an actual legitimate conflict with another group, and during that conflict they will take prisoners and they will sell those prisoners to the white slave traders. Later, though, there are actual wars that will be started just in the name of capturing slaves. It's not over territory. It's not over any kind of dispute within, two different nations or anything. It's just a going out and hunting for slaves to sell to the European slave traders. As it says there, somewhere around 10 to 13 million people are taken to the Americas. That's about as close as we can really get. It may be way more than that, and it may be less than that. But, the records, especially later on after the slave trade is supposed to be illegal, there aren't very good records for that. And so that's about as close as we really can get. And about 15% of those died in passage. About 2 million people died during the journey from Africa to the Americas. Now, this is where we're getting into a little bit of possible misconception. When, in like elementary school and junior high, when we've heard about these slave traders, a lot of times, at least in my school anyway, they were presented as psychotic almost, where they would throw, slaves over the side of the ship just for sport to watch the sharks eat them, and they were, really uncaring, evil individuals. Yes, they were uncaring, evil individuals, but if you look at this just in terms of economics, and please believe me, I'm not defending these guys at all, but if you look at this just in terms of economics, if they were to throw these slaves over the side for sport, or torture them, or maim them, or anything like that, when they get to the New World, they're going to have less people to sell. And so they're going to want these slaves to be in as good of conditions as they possibly can, so that they will bring the most profit. That said, they do understand that there will be losses. And so there are two different philosophies in slave traders as far as transporting these people to the New World. There are some people that are called loose packers, and they will take not quite so many people that occupy every square inch of the boat. The idea there is that if we don't carry as many people, we can carry more supplies, and these people will be in better health when we get there, and so they will bring more of a profit. On the other side of that, though, you have another group of slave traders, and these are tight packers. These folks will occupy every square inch that they possibly can on the slave ship. The idea that they have is that we're going to lose a good number of slaves. And so, the weaker ones will die off, but the stronger ones will survive and will make up in quantity, we'll have enough slaves so that even if we don't get as good of a price, we'll have enough so that we'll still make a decent profit on the trip. And so they do realize that some slaves will die, and these are the folks, the tide packers mainly, are the folks that you hear about that throw slaves overboard. That's any time that someone's going to die in this time period, they're going to bury them at sea. And with African slaves, they're just throwing them overboard. There's no ceremony really or anything, but so that's just an easiest way of disposing of the body. Anyway, once we get to America, we need to discuss how slavery works and the reason for turning to slavery. The other day, you should have read or watched one of the lecturettes on Bacon's Rebellion, and this exposed the tensions between the wealthy landowning colonials versus the poor colonials, and mainly those folks that came over as indentured servants. Indentured servants come over to the Americas with pretty much nothing. Once they're released, they're going to want their own farms, and the farmland that's to be had is to the west, and so they have to push further and further west, and that encroaches into Native American territory. Native Americans aren't going to be happy about that, and so there's conflict there. And so importing more indentured servants causes conflict, because eventually they are going to be free and they're going to want their own land. And also after the first few waves of indentured servants come over, there's less people in England that are wanting to come over and be indentured servants. So the price for those is going to get more expensive. After Bacon's Rebellion in 1675, you have a greater and greater turn toward African slavery in the New World, especially in the Americas, in what will be the United States. Once these people are purchased for roughly about the same price or a little bit more than an indentured servant, they are going to be slaves for life, and their children will be slaves for life. And so that is going to be a perpetual labor source, is the way that these folks are looking at, the white colonials are looking at that anyway. And so that's the big reason. Native Americans, there was an attempt to enslave them at first, but they're so susceptible to disease. Plus, you're not going very far to capture them, and so if they do get away, they're pretty close to being able to reunite with their people. And so that's problematic in terms of keeping them as a perpetual labor source. But African slaves, they're from another continent. They're not going back home. They're not going to be susceptible to diseases so much, because there was a lot of trade going on back and forth from Europe to the African continent. So they're really a pretty stable labor source. Now, originally, we're bringing this in for a couple of reasons, and I'll explain them when we get to them. But originally, most of the African slaves, like we said earlier, are going to be taken to the Caribbean. Slavery takes hold down there 1645, about 30 years before it does heavily in what will be the United States. The big thing here is that most of these plantations down there are going to be sugar plantations. This is very bad news for the slaves, and this is what we talked about, that most of the slavers in the Caribbean and South America were importing male slaves because males were seen as stronger and hardier, and so that they could be worked harder. Unfortunately, given the proximity to the equator, as well as just the long growing season there because of you're so close to the equator. The growing season down in the Caribbean is about 9 months out of the year. And you also have planting that you can do for about 2 months outside of that. And so you can pretty much work people farming for almost the entire year. And so a lot of times what they would do is you could plant a field, and once that field's planted, you can move on to the next field and have your crew harvest that one, replant it, move on to a third field, harvest that one, replant it, and keep moving around in this circle. And you could have these people working constantly. The bad thing about harvest time on a sugar plantation is that once the sugar cane is cut, it has to be processed very, very quickly. Otherwise, the cane starts turning bitter. And so during harvest time, which is a lot of the time in these areas, during harvest time, these slaves are going to be working about 19 to 20 hours a day. They're going to be working them as fast and as hard as they possibly can. And that's going to be 19, 20 hours a day for most of the year. And so these people a lot of times will be worked literally to death. Slave life expectancy once they reach the Caribbean is about 3 to 5 years. Slaves in that area do not live very long. From the plantation owner's point of view, though, the profits that can be made with sugar are so high that that's an acceptable loss. If a slave dies 3 to 5 years, that's fine. They've already, paid for them and made a profit on their labor, and so it's an acceptable loss to them, and that's the stark reality of it. It's really unfortunate. Just to give you an idea of all the bad things, in addition to being able to be worked to death on these sugar plantations, is that sugar cane's sweet. Sugar cane attracts mice, which attracts poisonous snakes. These guys are going through these fields, hacking at sugar cane, and so there's a lot of poisonous snakes in there. And so a lot of slaves will be bitten and die from snake bite poisoning. Also, since we're on this huge drive to crush and process the sugar cane as fast as possible, the picture there is a sugar cane press, and it's going to be turned, and you have to feed the sugar cane through those big grinders there in the center. Well, if you're doing that as fast as possible and there's not really much of a safety mechanism there, you can very easily get an arm caught in, just some fingers caught in there, and it may just pull your arm right off. And so a lot of slaves are going to be maimed and killed in this fashion. And then, if a slave is maimed and they lose an arm, they're not really that useful to the master. And so a lot of times they'll probably just be run off, and that person's not going to be able to make a living, and so they'll probably die of starvation pretty quickly if they don't die of some sort of infection or just bleeding out. Now, the reason that I bring that up is that in the 1660s, a lot of English will start going into the Bahamas and trying to purchase land for sugar plantations. Unfortunately for them, all of the land has already been claimed, but during their time in the Caribbean, they will start to pick up on the way that slave plantations are run down there, and they will bring that knowledge back to what will be the United States when they leave the Caribbean, because there's no land to be had, and they will come to what's going to be the United States, and they will start staking out plantations there. They'll bring a lot of what are called the slave codes, the laws that dictate what you're allowed and what you're not allowed to do to your slaves and how to run a plantation. In general, the slave codes say pretty much you can do anything that you want to your slaves, and there's very, very little possibility of being punished. I'm going to go through a few of these just to give you an idea about how bad they are. But if let's say a master beat his slave to death, on the off chance that does go to trial, as long as the jury determines that it wasn't intentional, that if the master was just beating the slave and the slave accidentally died, and the master didn't really intend for the slave to die, then there's really nothing, the master will be acquitted of that. It doesn't fall for an involuntary manslaughter or anything like that. It's just not a crime. It's you accidentally beat your slave to death, and that's unfortunate. If the jury decides that the master did kill the slave on purpose, that it just went into a rage and just beat the slave to death on purpose, most of the time the master will just pay a small fine, and really in pure economic terms, the master lost more money in the death of that slave than they would in the paying of the small fine. But that's it, though. That's the extent of their punishment, that they pay a small fine. There's no jail time. There's no, you killed a person and so you have to be executed. No, there's none of that. It's just a small fine. Not only could a master punish the slave, but any white guy walking down the street, like if a slave is in town and a white guy sees the slave and asks for a pass, which is written permission for that slave to be off the plantation, if the slave cannot produce that, then it's pretty acceptable for just any white person, any white guy, to give that slave what is called a moderate whipping, and usually that's no more than 50 lashes. And as you can see in the picture there, that can leave some pretty horrendous scarring, and so that was just absolutely terrible. For stealing food, sometimes a slave's ears might be sliced off. If a slave poisoned their masters, they were typically hanged, sometimes burned to death, especially if slaves were found to be involved in any kind of slave revolt. They would burn those slaves alive. And so in that environment, especially in South America, slaves really don't live very long. North America, slaves fare better, not because masters in North America were nice or anything. It's just that the seasons weren't, the growing seasons weren't as long, and they weren't producing sugar in most places, and so the pace of work wasn't as extreme. There wasn't a need to work people like that. So once that picks up, that's going to pick up in that second stage there, 1640 to 1660. In the first stage of slavery in the American colonies, 1619, that year, 1619 is important. That year, 19 Africans arrive into the North American colonies. They were considered slaves. We honestly don't know what happened to them. We don't know what eventually became of them. But that 20 years there, after that first group of 19 arrived, things are pretty loose as far as the treatment of slaves. One of the justifications for enslaving Africans was that they weren't Christians. And so in those early years, if a slave converted to Christianity, well, that justification for enslaving them is no longer there. And so some masters will actually free their slaves for converting to Christianity. That is obviously not going to last. Other slaves will be treated as exactly as indentured servants. They will live in the same household as the family. They're not a separate slave quarters. And sometimes slaves will be freed after 5 to 7 years, just like an indentured servant would. That also is not going to last. So in the early years, things are pretty loose, and we're, as a society, people aren't really sure exactly how this whole African slavery is going to play out. The second 20 years, though, 1640 to 1660, things are going to start changing. And there's going to be some serious changes. One of the big things is African American women, slave women, are going to be sent to start working out in the fields. This is a big deal. This is a big difference between now slave women and indentured servant women. It would be completely socially frowned upon for someone to send a white indentured servant woman to work out in the fields. That's not women's work. Indentured servant women, they're doing stereotypically women's work. They're cooking, they're cleaning, they're taking care of the children, things like that. But once in the 1640s, once plantation owners start sending African slave women to work out in the fields, then they're making a very big statement there that these people are not our equals. Their women are not going to be looked at as women. They're looked at it as something else. And so you're justifying increased changes for the treatment of African slaves. Second big item: African slaves were forbidden to have any kind of weapons. We're seeing a lot more abuses, a lot more ill treatment of slaves, and given that, you really don't want them to have the means to rise up and kill all the masters easily. So that's going to change. One of the third things, and these are all laws that are eventually going to be passed. Some of them are ignored a little. Third big one is that interracial sexual relations are made illegal. Now this one has some twists to it. This mainly applies to relationships between white women and black males. White women are seen as sort of, the ideal womanhood kind of notions, and that these women are to be placed on pedestals sort of things. And it's a big sense of masculinity, especially in the South, that, we have to protect our women kind of a thing. On the other side of that, though, so that's completely will be prosecuted. If that occurs, a lot of times the white woman will be chastised. She'll be sort of outcast by the community. The black male will sometimes be branded or even executed for that. So that's not gonna fly. On the other side of that, sexual relations between white males and slave females are going to largely be ignored. It's just something that people are going to do their best to ignore. And so this is very kind of a two-way street that is not at all equitable. So, four, the big change. Some slaves are going to be held as laborers for life, and their status was going to be passed on to their children. That's that chattel slavery term in parentheses. that these people are slaves for life, and their children will be slaves. The status of the mother is passed on to the status of the child. Usually in most American culture anyway, we kind of look at the status of the father as the status of the child. But in this situation, it's going to be reversed, and a large part of that is that if you think about livestock, and that's the way people are thinking about slaves, as livestock. If you buy a cow and the cow's pregnant, well, when the cow has that calf, then, whoever owns the cow owns the calf. Well, the same thing is going to occur with slavery here. So slaves are increasingly looked at as livestock and not actual people. And in these people's minds, it's easier to justify the treatment of slaves if they can make that leap. 1660 to 1860, that 200 years, slavery is going to be officially recognized, legally regulated. Most states are going to pass laws regulating slavery, and it will be codified and set up that way until the Civil War. Now we're going to get into some of the different kinds of slaves and what these people do. The first one is the house slave, and everybody kind of pictures the slave lady from Gone with the Wind. I can't remember what her name was. Primary tasks for these people are cooking, cleaning. A lot of times they'll take care of the children, both the slave children as well as the white children. And there are advantages to being a house slave. Living in, a lot of the time these people will sleep in the kitchen, but they will be in the master's house all day long, and so they will hear a lot of the comings and goings and a lot of the news. So they will have knowledge of everyone's business in the house. Sometimes they can have advanced knowledge of pending sales, and so say Bob is going to be sold, then the house slave can warn Bob that a potential buyer is going to be coming by, and that maybe he should act sick or injured or something like that. And when the master and some other white guy are walking through the fields, instead of working like he regularly would work, Bob can act like he has a limp or some kind of problem, and then the guy might be reluctant to purchase him, and separate him from Bob's family. The disadvantage to being a house slave is that the slave is closest to the master, and so there are a lot of potential negatives that come from that. If the master flies into a rage, that's the closest person that it's acceptable to take that rage out on. And so there's a lot of physical abuse that goes on. And that the house slave, it's not justified anyway, but the house slave didn't even have to do anything. If the master just gets angry, that's the closest person there that's acceptable to be beat on. And so that's the way that goes. Also, since the person is inside the house without anyone else there to kind of look out for them or help them out, there's a lot of risk of sexual abuse from the master, his sons, and even male relatives that might come and visit and stay a few days. And so there's a lot of potential for sexual abuse as well as physical abuse from the house slaves, to the house slaves, sorry. Field slaves. Most slaves are going to be field slaves, and these are kind of, when we think of slavery in the 1800s, these are the people that we're thinking of. A lot of times the field hands will be sent out to the fields to start working when they're 8 or 9 years old. Maybe sooner, but that's typically about the age that they go out to start working. Disadvantage of being a field slave is that it's much harder work than being in the house and cooking. all day, which that's kind of obvious. But these people are out harvesting cotton or planting cotton or harvesting or planting other kinds of crops. And for the most part, they're out there from, the morning until night, and they will be worked all day long. So the work's harder out there. On the upside of being a field slave is there's a much better chance for escape. If one of these plantation owners has a huge plantation of, 200 to 300 to 400 acres, they're not going to be able to watch all the slaves out there working that area all the time. And so there is a much better chance for escape because of the lack of supervision. Another category that we usually don't hear from are skilled slaves. And these are slaves that were typically purchased by a blacksmith, a carpenter, some iron workers will purchase slaves, and usually they're purchased as sort of an apprentice, as a helper, and then over the years of working as a helper, they just gradually pick up on the job, and eventually they can do this on their own. They'll just pick up the trade. They're kind of interesting because a lot of times the owners will hire them out. If the owner's most likely not going to have a constant supply of blacksmith work for the slave to do, or a constant supply of carpentry work, and the owner can hire them out to other whites in the community to do work for them, and to ensure that the slave will do a good job. A lot of times the owner will allow the slave to keep a small portion of what they earned. Most of the time, probably 95% of the time, if not a little more, this extra money is going to be used to buy, some extra clothing or better food or things like that. There are rare occasions that some of these slaves will save up enough money to purchase their own freedom, but I guess this can be counted as a disadvantage. Even though the slave is actually able to save up money because of their skill, because they are a blacksmith or because they are a carpenter, they're worth more money than the average slave. And so, even though they're actually able to save up money, their purchase price, given their skill set, is increased to the point where most of these people probably are not going to be able to purchase their freedom. But that extra money that they do, that little bit of money that they do bring in, makes their life somewhat more tolerable. Now, we also have to consider that these are human beings, and that, even under the most brutal conditions and the most tyrannical sort of treatment, people are going to resist, and they're going to do things to be able to thwart their masters or overseers. And so some of the things that slaves do are going to be breaking tools. If you're working on a fence, doing some carpentry work or something like that, and some of your tools break, well, you can't work until that tool can be replaced or repaired. This can be done occasionally, but if you're doing this all the time, the overseer, the master's gonna figure it out, and you're gonna suffer a beating for that, most likely. So that can be employed occasionally. Second thing are work slowdowns. And what slaves do here is, if you've ever heard any of the old spirituals that are sung sometimes in African American churches, or are really good examples if you ever watched the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? The opening scene, there's a chain gang, and they're all out breaking rocks on the road, and they're singing this very, very slow rhythmic song, and on the beat, which is, you know, just a really slow kind of constant beat, that's a hammer strike. And so everyone's working at a very slow pace, but it's slow enough to get, you know, that you're going to get the work done, but it's slow enough that you're not going to wear yourself out. And you're also not going so slow that you're going to be punished for it. So it's kind of a negotiated, unspoken negotiated kind of a thing. The last most common, I guess, form of resistance is running away. And a lot of times we hear about the long-term runaways, and the slaves that, you know, Harriet Tubman or people like Frederick Douglass, that they run away into the North or into Canada and they achieve their freedom on a permanent basis. That's not going to be true for the majority of slaves. And practically the only slaves that are going to be able to achieve that long-term runaway status are slaves that are in the upper South. So slaves that are in Maryland or in the upper portions of Virginia, maybe even Kentucky. Those slaves don't have a lot of territory to cross before they're into free territory. You know, they move maybe 100 miles and they're into free territory there. You know, once you get to the north, there's going to be a lot more people willing to help, and there's not going to be constant slave patrols running around. And so there's a much more likelihood for these people to actually get away. One of the more interesting ones of these is a guy named Henry Box Brown. He was from, I believe, Maryland, I think. And he built a crate, put some supplies in there, stuck himself on a train, or had somebody put him on a train, and shipped himself to a Philadelphia abolitionist. That train ride couldn't have taken more than a couple of days, though, otherwise he would have died. So, you know, the only people that are really able to do this short-term, the long-term runaways, the permanent kind of status changes, are people in the upper South. Short-term runaways are much more common. These are people in the deep South, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi. There's no way that if you're in, you know, the southern part of Mississippi or southern parts of Georgia, that you're going to be able to travel all the way up, you know, past the Mason-Dixon line. It's just not going to happen. That's too far to go. The odds of somebody getting caught there, you know, on the way are just way too high. And so this other form of running away, kind of the short-term running away, is going to develop down in the deep South. And what happens here is that a slave would run away, but they will go hide out in the woods, or if you're in Georgia, you might go to the Okefenokee swamps or something like that. And through an intermediary, another slave that knows where, you know, Jim is, they will negotiate with the master about coming back. You know, you can, I'll come back if, you know, I'm not worked as hard, or I'm not going to be punished as much, you know, for running away, that kind of thing. And, you know, and if you think about it, you're like, well, what's going to prevent the master from just, you know, once Jim comes back, beating the heck out of him? Well, if you do that, then Jim's just going to run away again. And so the master actually kind of has to, in a sense, uphold his end of the bargain. If you don't want to negotiate, Jim's out there in the middle of the Okefenokee swamp, and so you can go out there and hunt for Jim with gators and water moccasins and all kinds of, you know, dangerous animals that are going to try to eat you. And you also lose all those, you know, several days, maybe even a week or two of hunting for this guy, when you can just agree to not punish him as much or not work him as hard. You know, now that can't be abused. If Jim constantly runs away, then, you know, he might be shackled at night or something like that. And so it's, you can do things, but you have to kind of judge and not push things too awful far. Also, any runaways, these people are worth a lot of money as a commodity. In today's money, a slave is probably around $20,000. If you kind of take 1800s money and adjust for inflation and stuff like that, a slave would probably run about $20,000. And so, slave owners are very much going to want to regain their property. And a lot of times you'll see advertisements in various newspapers that, a certain, in this case, James Wood is looking for a slave Martin. But here's the issue with that, especially if you get into the upper South, where slaves are going to be running into the North and then living in open society as freed people. Martin's 23 years old. He has a pleasing countenance. He's got a round face. He's quick-spoken. He can tell us a plausible story. Shining black, stout-built, large, with small feet, and the toe next to his big toe has been mashed off. Well, that's not very specific. The only outstanding feature that distinguishes Martin from pretty much anyone else that's an African American, 23 years old, and is kind of dark skinned, is that the toe next to his big toe has been smashed off. If if a slave catcher goes up into the North and just captures a random African American guy that's about 23 years old, and takes him down to James Wood and to claim that $20, the odds are that James Wood is not going to be that picky. If it's Martin or not, it's just an African American guy that can be enslaved, and that's fine. Your new name is Martin, and that's the way that's going to go. It doesn't matter if they actually capture the escaped slave or not. They are going to return an African American male that's about 23 years old. And so there's a lot of leeway in recapturing supposed escaped slaves.